It started in a small, quiet town where faith was everything and reputation meant more than truth. The pastor's son, Daniel, was the pride of the community, soft-spoken, kind, and raised to walk a path of righteousness. Every Sunday, people watched him sit in the front pew beside his father, his hands folded, his gaze steady. He was supposed to be perfect, the example every parent pointed to when speaking of discipline and devotion. But what no one knew was that behind his calm smile lived a storm he couldn't silence, a battle between who he was expected to be and who he really was inside. The whispers began one autumn morning when Daniel didn't show up for church. His father preached that day with a trembling voice, pretending everything was fine, but the empty seat in the front row screamed louder than any sermon. Days later, word spread like wildfire. Daniel had been seen riding with a biker club. Leather jacket, tattoos, the same group of men the townsfolk warned their children about. To them, it was rebellion, a scandal. But to Daniel, it was something else entirely. It was freedom. The townspeople talked about him like a lost cause. The pastor's son has fallen, they said. He's ruined the family's name. But none of them knew the truth. The reason he left wasn't out of anger or pride, but out of pain. He had spent years pretending, trying to be perfect, while quietly drowning under expectations that left no room for mistakes. The open road, the roar of the engines, the brotherhood of men who judged no one by their past. That was where he finally found peace. One evening, his father stood at the pulpit and asked the congregation to pray for his son. But deep down, he was wrestling with something else, fear that he had lost him forever. Yet, miles away, Daniel wasn't lost. He was learning. The bikers who had once terrified the town were showing him lessons the church never did, about loyalty, forgiveness, and what it truly meant to live by grace. And when he finally returned, months later, no one was ready for what he had become. Because Daniel wasn't the same boy who left in silence. He came back carrying a truth the entire town needed to hear. What they saw as rebellion had become redemption, and what they had judged as sin had turned into the most powerful testimony they would ever witness. Daniel's first night on the road was nothing like the quiet world he'd left behind. The air was thick with the scent of gasoline and dust, the sky endless and heavy with stars. The rhythmic roar of engines replaced the hymns he had grown up hearing. Around the campfire, the bikers didn't speak much at first. They simply nodded in acknowledgement as he sat down. No sermons, no questions, no judgment. For the first time in his life, silence didn't mean pressure. It meant peace. The leader of the club, a man named Hawk, studied him from across the flames. His eyes were sharp but not unkind. "You don't look like a runaway," he said finally. Daniel hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I'm not running," he said softly. "I'm searching." Hawk smiled faintly. "We all are, kid. The question is, what are you looking for?" Daniel didn't have an answer then, but the question stayed with him for days. Over the next few weeks, Daniel learned that these men, the ones the town called dangerous, lived by a code that was raw and real. They didn't hide their scars. They didn't pretend to be saints. They had seen darkness, faced it, and chosen loyalty over loneliness. They didn't talk about faith, but they lived it in their own way. When a fellow rider's bike broke down, everyone stopped to help. When a stranger needed a meal, they shared what little they had. It wasn't holiness in words. It was holiness in action. At night, Daniel would lie awake, staring at the stars. The road stretched endlessly before him, and yet he felt closer to God than he ever had in the church pews. He realized something he had never dared to think before. Maybe God wasn't confined to the walls of a building. Maybe he was here, in the dust and noise, in the laughter and pain, in the brotherhood of broken men trying to do right by each other. Meanwhile, back in town, his father was breaking too. Each Sunday, the congregation watched a man who preached about forgiveness, but couldn't find it for himself. Every sermon felt heavier, his words trembling under the weight of his worry. Late at night, when the church was empty, he would whisper, "Lord, please bring my son home." What he didn't know was that his son had found home. It's not the one he had expected. Months passed, and Daniel became one of them. Not because of leather jackets or patched vests, but because of what they represented: unity, loyalty, and freedom. Hawk took him under his wing, teaching him not just how to ride, but how to live. Out here, Hawk said one morning as they watched the sunrise over the open desert, you learn that life isn't about looking perfect. It's about showing up, even when you're broken. Those words struck Daniel deeper than any sermon ever had. He began to see faith differently. It wasn't about rules or rituals. It was about grace. He saw in the way Hawk forgave a rival who had wronged him years ago, in the way the club protected small towns from corrupt men, and in how they treated him, not as the pastor's son, but as a brother. In their imperfection, Daniel found the truest kind of goodness, one that didn't need to announce itself to be real. But life on the road wasn't without challenges. One evening, the group stopped in a small town where people recognized the symbol on their jackets. Fear followed them into every diner, every gas station, every glance. Daniel watched how the locals crossed the street to avoid them, the same way his own church had once whispered about men like that. He felt the sting of hypocrisy and realized how easily people mistake appearance for truth. That night, while cleaning his bike, Daniel asked Hawk, "How do you live with everyone thinking you're the bad guy?" Hawk chuckled softly. "Kid, I stopped living for their approval a long time ago. I just try to do right by the people in front of me. The rest, well, that's between me and God." Daniel nodded, understanding more than ever that real faith wasn't about being seen. It was about being genuine. Meanwhile, the news of Daniel's new life reached his hometown. The whispers turned to outrage. "The pastor's son is riding with sinners," they said. Some even stopped attending church, claiming the preacher couldn't lead when his own son had lost his soul. But while they spoke of disgrace, Daniel was out there living a kind of faith they had long forgotten, the kind that moves through actions, not titles. One late evening, the bikers stopped at a roadside diner tucked between two dusty highways. The air was thick with the smell of oil and coffee, the hum of neon lights flickering above them. As they walked in, conversations fell silent. The locals stared with that familiar mix of fear and judgment. Daniel felt the sting of it, but Hawk didn't flinch. He had seen it all before. They took their seats quietly, their presence commanding but not threatening. The waitress hesitated before approaching, her hands trembling slightly. Hawk smiled gently. "Don't worry, ma'am. We're not trouble. Just hungry." The kindness in his tone disarmed her. As she poured coffee into chipped mugs, Daniel noticed something. The way her shoulders relaxed, the way her fear began to fade. Small moments like that taught him more about grace than all the sermons he had ever heard. It wasn't in preaching or in loud words. It was in how you treated people who were afraid of you. That night, as they rode back under the blanket of stars, Daniel thought about his father. He wondered if the man who had taught him about forgiveness would ever forgive him for leaving. He wanted to believe so, but doubt lingered. The wind rushed past him, carrying the sound of the engines like a hymn. For the first time, he whispered a prayer, not for himself, but for his father. "Help him see me, Lord, not for what I've done, but for who I'm becoming." The next morning, Hawk handed Daniel a newspaper that had been left at the diner. The headline read, "Pastor's son still missing. Church prays for his return." Beneath it was a photo of his father, older and more tired than Daniel remembered, his eyes hollow. The guilt hit Daniel like a punch to the chest. He folded the paper slowly, his voice trembling. "He still thinks I'm lost." Hawk looked at him for a long time and said quietly, "Then maybe it's time you remind him you were found." Those words followed Daniel for days. Every mile they rode, every sunrise they chased, the thought of his father waiting and praying weighed heavier. He knew he couldn't stay away forever. He had found his freedom, yes, but true freedom, he realized, wasn't about running from who you were. It was about returning stronger, wiser, ready to heal what was broken. The journey back wasn't easy. Weeks passed before Daniel finally told Hawk he needed to go home. The old biker simply nodded, his weathered face unreadable. "You don't owe anyone an explanation, kid," he said. "But when you get there, don't go to prove them wrong. Go to show them who you really are." Hawk offered him a firm handshake that turned into a hug, brief, but full of unspoken understanding. "Remember," he said as Daniel mounted his bike, "Grace rides with you." The ride home felt different from every other. The road he once saw as an escape now looked like a bridge, a connection between two worlds he finally understood could coexist. As he approached the town's outskirts, Memories came rushing back. The church bell on Sunday mornings, the smell of his mother's olden books, the echo of his father's voice preaching about mercy. He wasn't the same boy who had left. He was a man who had lived, fallen, and risen again. When he arrived, people stopped and stared. The pastor's son, on a motorcycle, wearing leather, his hair longer, his skin tanned from the road. Whispers spread faster than wildfire. He came back. Look at him. What happened to that boy? But Daniel didn't flinch. He parked his bike right in front of the church and walked up the steps, the familiar creak beneath his boots echoing through his soul. Inside, his father stood at the pulpit, mid-sermon. The congregation froze as Daniel entered. The pastor's words faltered. The silence was thick enough to feel. For a long, unbearable moment, they just stared at each other. Father and son, two men divided by expectation but bound by love. Then, slowly, Daniel took off his jacket and placed it over the front pew, revealing a small cross tattooed on his forearm. His father's eyes widened. Daniel spoke softly, his voice carrying through the church. You taught me about God, Dad, but it was out there, on the road, with people you called sinners, that I finally met him. The room fell silent. No one breathed. And in that stillness, something sacred happened, the kind of moment no sermon could ever create. A father saw his son not as a disappointment, but as a living testament of grace. For a long time, the church remained frozen in silence. The congregation didn't know whether to judge or to listen. The pastor, his voice trembling, stepped down from the pulpit and walked slowly toward his son. Years of unspoken pain filled the space between them. Daniel lowered his eyes, bracing himself for disappointment. But when his father finally spoke, his words broke like dawn through the dark. You came home, he said softly. His voice wasn't angry. It was broken, full of love he had tried too hard to bury. Daniel nodded, tears glinting in his eyes. I never stopped believing, Dad, he whispered. I just stopped belonging. The pastor's hands trembled as he reached out and pulled his son into an embrace. For the first time in years, Daniel felt something he hadn't known he was missing, a father's forgiveness. Around them, the people who had once whispered now stood in awe, watching grace unfold before their very eyes. Then, as if carried by the wind, Hawk's words echoed in Daniel's mind. Don't go to prove them wrong. Go to show them who you really are. So he did. He turned to the congregation, his voice steady but full of emotion. You all think I turned my back on God. But out there, on the road, among the broken and the lost, I found him in places you'd never expect. I saw him in kindness without judgment, in loyalty without condition, in forgiveness without walls. No one moved. Some people cried quietly. Others bowed their heads, ashamed of how easily they had condemned what they didn't understand. The pastor placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder and said to his congregation, My son went searching for God, and he found him where we forgot to look. The church that had once seen him as a symbol of shame now saw him as a living sermon, a reminder that grace doesn't always wear a tie or stand behind a pulpit. Sometimes it rides on two wheels and carries the dust of the road. That night, father and son sat on the church steps long after everyone had left. The town was quiet, the stars burning bright above them. Daniel looked out at the empty streets and whispered, I didn't come back to stay. There's still more road left for me. His father smiled faintly. Then go, he said. Just promise me one thing. Wherever you ride, carry what you've learned. Not everyone gets to see God the way you have. The next morning, word spread across town like wildfire. People who had once criticized the pastor's son now spoke of him differently. Some said he was reckless. Others said he was brave. But no one could deny the truth in his story. The same church that had once pitted his father now filled its pews with new faces. People drawn not by perfection, but by honesty. They wanted to hear about the faith that rode through deserts and storms, the kind that found light in the darkest places. Daniel stayed for a few more days, helping his father repair the old church roof and sharing stories with curious townsfolk. He spoke not as a preacher, but as someone who had lived both grace and failure. When a young man approached him after service, saying he felt too far gone to be forgiven, Daniel smiled gently and said, You can't outrun grace. Trust me, I tried. That single line became the town's most repeated quote. Before leaving, Daniel visited the grave of his mother, who had passed while he was away. He placed his leather jacket over the headstone, whispering, "I finally found peace, Mom. I hope you be proud." The wind rustled through the trees as if in response, and for the first time, he felt her presence not in sorrow, but in quiet understanding. It was as if her spirit, too, rode alongside him on every mile of his journey. When he finally started his motorcycle, the townspeople gathered outside the church to watch. His father stood near the steps, one hand over his heart. "You'll always have a home here," he called out. Daniel smiled beneath his helmet. "And you'll always be with me," he replied. As he revved the engine, the deep rumble filled the air, a sound that once represented rebellion, but now carried the weight of redemption. The pastor's son rode off into the horizon, the sun casting long golden rays across the open road. The town watched until he disappeared beyond the hills. And for years to come, they would tell the story of the boy who left to find freedom and returned to teach them what grace really meant. That faith isn't something you find in a building. It's something you carry in your soul, no matter how far you ride. Daniel rode for days without stopping, the horizon always ahead, endless and alive. The world around him changed, from small towns to open plains, from empty deserts to crowded cities. But something within him had settled. The restless boy who once fled from expectations had become a man who understood his purpose. Every time the wind brushed his face, it felt like a whisper of grace, reminding him that freedom was not rebellion. It was reconciliation between the heart and the truth. One night, under a sky painted with moonlight, he found Hawk again. The old biker was sitting by a fire near a long stretch of highway, surrounded by the same familiar brothers. When Daniel approached, Hawk looked up with a slow grin. "Didn't think you'd ride back this way," he said. Daniel chuckled softly. "Guess the road had more to teach me." The two clasped hands, not as mentor and student, but as equals, two souls who had both walked through fire and come out whole. Hawk poured Daniel a cup of coffee and studied him through the steam. "You've changed," he said. "Got that peace in your eyes. Most men spend a lifetime chasing that and never find it." Daniel nodded slowly. "It's strange," he said. "I had to lose everything I thought I was to find who I really am." Hawk laughed quietly. "That's the road, kid. It doesn't give you what you want. It strips away what you don't need." As the night deepened, the conversation turned quiet. The hum of cicadas filled the silence, and the crackling fire painted golden shadows across their faces. Hawk reached into his jacket and pulled out an old, worn patch, the symbol of the Brotherhood. "You earned this a long time ago," he said, handing it to Daniel. "Not because you ride fast, but because you ride true." Daniel took it, feeling its weight not as a badge of honor, but as a sacred reminder of the road he had traveled. Before dawn, as the engines roared to life once more, Daniel rode at the front beside Hawk. The wind cut through the cold, the stars fading into the first light of morning. For the first time, he realized that he didn't just belong to the church or the Brotherhood. He belonged to both. He was proof that faith didn't have to fit into walls or labels. It could live in the roar of an engine, in the dirt beneath your boots, in the forgiveness you give and receive. Weeks later, they arrived in a small town much like the one Daniel had grown up in. Its streets were quiet, its people cautious, its church half empty. When they pulled in, the townsfolk peered out from behind windows, murmuring about the loud motorcycles and leather-clad men who had appeared without warning. But instead of chaos, something unexpected happened. The bikers didn't bring trouble. They brought hope. A storm had torn through the area a few days earlier, leaving roofs damaged and roads blocked. Without hesitation, Hawk and his men began helping. They lifted debris, repaired fences, and shared food with families who had lost everything. Daniel joined them, his hands raw but his heart full. The people watched in disbelief as the very men they feared worked harder than anyone else to restore their town. One afternoon, as Daniel was fixing a broken window, a young boy approached him timidly. "Are you really one of them?" he asked. Daniel smiled, kneeling to meet his eyes. "I'm one of many," he said gently. "But you know what makes us who we are? We don't leave anyone behind." The boy nodded slowly, his eyes shining with something that looked like admiration. It was the same look Daniel once gave his father. By the end of the week, the town had changed. The people no longer looked at the bikers with fear, but with gratitude. The pastor of the small church invited them to attend Sunday service. Hawk chuckled and said, "We might not fit the dress code, but we'll show up." And they did, sitting quietly in the back, their presence humbling everyone in the room. When the preacher spoke about grace, Daniel closed his eyes and smiled. He didn't need to hear it. He was living it. When they left the next morning, the whole town gathered to see them off. Children waved, mothers cried, and even the pastor blessed their journey. Daniel looked back one last time at the place that had once feared them and now saw them as brothers. The road stretched before him again, wide, open, full of possibility. And for the first time, he realized that every mile he rode wasn't taking him farther from his past. It was carrying him closer to his purpose. The miles rolled on, and with each new town, Daniel began to see a pattern. The same walls of fear, the same distrust toward those who looked different or lived freely. But something within him had changed. He no longer carried resentment toward that fear. Instead, he met it with compassion. Every stop became an opportunity, every conversation a seed. The bikers, once branded as outlaws, were becoming something greater, messengers of quiet redemption. And without realizing it, Daniel had become their voice. One evening, they arrived at a crossroads where the highway split in two directions. Hawk pulled over and gestured for the group to stop. The setting sun bled across the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, painting their faces with firelight. "This is where I leave it to you," Hawk said, turning to Daniel. "You've got something the world needs to hear. My road's almost done, but yours is just beginning." The words hung heavy in the air. Daniel shook his head. "I'm not ready." Hawk chuckled softly. "You think any of us were? The road doesn't wait for ready men. It builds them." With that, the older man handed him a small silver cross that hung from his neck. "Carry it. It's seen a lot of storms." Daniel took it with trembling hands, realizing this wasn't just a gift. It was a mantle. Hawk revved his bike, saluted him, and with a roar of engines, half the crew followed him west while the rest looked to Daniel, waiting for direction. The weight of leadership pressed on him, but it wasn't heavy. It was sacred. He looked out at the road ahead and whispered, "Then let's ride where we're needed." They moved like thunder across the plains, helping where they could, lifting spirits, mending what was broken, not with sermons, but with service. The name of their group began to spread, but not through newspapers or television. It spread through whispers, through grateful hearts, through those who had once lost faith and found it again because of a group of men the world called sinners. And somewhere on that same road, miles away, his father stood on the steps of his church, looking toward the horizon as if he could hear the faint echo of engines in the distance. "God," he said quietly, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips, "thank you for using the broken to heal the world." Years later, Daniel stood beside his bike, overlooking a vast valley where the sky met the earth in an endless embrace. Time had carved lines on his face, but peace lived in his eyes. Around him stood a new generation of writers, men and women who had heard his story and found their own redemption through it. They wore the same patch Hawk once gave him, but now it bore a new phrase beneath the emblem: "Grace rides with us." He had become what his father once was, a guide, though not behind a pulpit, but on the open road. His church was the wind, his congregation the lost souls who crossed his path. Every writer carried a story, and Daniel made sure each one knew they were more than their mistakes. "You don't have to be perfect to do good," he often said. "You just have to be willing." His message was simple, but it rippled farther than he ever imagined, across highways, across hearts, across generations. One day, he returned to his hometown, not as the prodigal son, but as a man whose faith had been tested, tempered, and proven. The church was smaller now, but inside, he found his father's Bible resting on the altar. His father had passed on, but his spirit lingered in every word. Daniel placed Hawk's cross beside it, whispering, "Your prayers reached me, Dad. But the road made me who I am." As he stepped outside, the townsfolk greeted him warmly, no longer as an outcast, but as a brother. Children pointed at his bike with wide eyes, and parents smiled instead of frowning. Redemption had come full circle, not through force or preaching, but through time, understanding, and love that refused to give up. Daniel realized then that every mile he had ridden was never about running from home. It was about bringing home to everyone he met. As the engine started once more and the sun dipped low, Daniel looked at his riders and said, "Where there's pain, we ride. Where there's silence, we speak. And where there's judgment, we forgive." The roar of their bikes filled the air again, not as noise, but as a hymn. And long after they disappeared beyond the hills, the wind carried their message through every town and every heart they touched. Grace rides with those who dare to love without walls. Daniel's journey was never just about leaving home or riding the open road. It was about discovering what it truly means to live with courage, integrity, and faith. Every mile he traveled taught him that freedom is not the absence of rules, but the presence of grace. The bikers, the roads, and the challenges he faced were not obstacles. They were teachers. Through them, he learned that real strength comes from lifting others up, even when the world doubts you, and that redemption is earned not by words, but by actions. The small towns he passed through, once filled with judgment and fear, became places of understanding and hope. People saw what he represented, not a rebel, but a living testament that mistakes do not define you. Your choices do. Daniel became proof that one person, willing to face both their past and their fears, can change an entire community. Faith was no longer confined to walls or pulpit. It lived in the acts of kindness, the loyalty of the brotherhood, and the courage to stand for what is right. The legacy of his ride was not only in the miles or the bikers who followed him, but in the hearts he touched. Every young person who once felt powerless, every adult who had lost hope, saw in Daniel a reflection of what could be possible when you choose honor over fear, compassion over cruelty, and action over indifference. The roar of engines was no longer intimidating. It became a symbol of persistence, redemption, and living a life that others could aspire to emulate. And so, when Daniel looked back on his journey, he realized that the road had never been about escape. It had been about transformation, of himself, of his father, of the towns, and of every soul willing to listen. The lessons he learned from Hawk, the bikers, and his own struggles became a truth that transcended geography. Faith is proven in the way you treat others. Courage is measured by the choices you make when no one is watching, and honor rides with those who dare to act with integrity. If this story moved you, let it inspire the way you live today. Share your thoughts in the comments about a moment that changed your life. Give this video a like to honor the power of courage and grace, and subscribe to join a community that celebrates stories that lift the human spirit. Because the road of life may be long, but the acts of honor we carry along the way echo farther than we can ever imagine.